Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show, while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, over the weekend we saw pandemonium and chaos break out in Charlottesville, Virginia. And of course, the reason that this all came to a head was over the proposed and approved removal of a statue of Confederate General, leader of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's statue in a public park. It's got all of the strains of the summer of political correctness, the summer of 2015, the summer that we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, launched our state-of-the-art radio program, but it took a turn for the worse. It took a turn for the worst, because there are those dark, twisted, disparate, and competing factions that have come forth. Identity politics, something that my first officer, Jeremy Grapington, and yours truly have warned you about time and again on previous episodes of the Wright Flyer, came to the epicenter. And again, it reminds me of something that we have oft-times reiterated, almost to the point of it reaching ad nauseum, that of the farewell address of the father of our nation, George Washington, back in 1796, when he implored the American people not to break down into disparate and competing factions, because in so doing, we would begin to lose sight of what the big picture is, what it is that's important, what it is that matters to us as a nation and people. And unfortunately, that's what's happening here. This is what happens when we forget the old axiom that the United States is a nation of laws and not of men. That we are endowed by our Creator with certain fundamental and inalienable God-given rights, and that when we break away from that, or when we forget that that is a quintessential aspect of who we are, both as a nation and people, that is when we begin to see this type of pandemonium break out. Now, of course, the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media are going to attempt to paint this as Donald Trump not doing enough to snuff out white supremacists, while ignoring that there were groups such as Antifa, some rabid left-wing supposed anti-fascist organization that has been promoting and pushing for violence to create a specific narrative, to essentially convince the American people that there is only one side here that is wrong. But that's just not the case. The fact of the matter is, all of these elements are dark, nefarious, and twisted. The alt-right we've warned about on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, is certainly attempting to propel us to some sort of tribalist notion or definition of nationalism, which goes against the very core of the natural law tenets that underpin not only our shared United States Constitution, which, pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2, what is known in the common American vernacular as the Supremacy Clause, but also of our entire republic. This is where we are. We have these disparate and competing factions coming forth, attempting to fundamentally, permanently, and dare I say irreparably transform these United States of America away from being a constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic into some sort of dystopia. And I say dystopia because there really is no more apt a term to describe what it is that they are wanting to bring to fruition here in the heart of the land of the free and the home of the brave. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, as I sit here speaking into this microphone, conveying this message to you, our cherished listening passengers and audience members, it shows no signs of improving within the foreseeable future. The conservatives in America have essentially walked into a trap. Conservatives always want to preserve the history of their nation, the time-honored and well-established traditions, values, and institutions that have guided this nation for well over 2 centuries now. However, what the left is doing is they are spinning the narrative. And it's as I've always said, they are masters at spinning the narrative. They are propagandists first and foremost, come hell or high water. And the narrative that they're wanting to spin is that this was all the plan from the beginning. And it may have been. At least for certain elements of it. Because one of the so-called white nationalist leaders that had organized this was an Obama supporter. Now, it's amazing to see that. It's amazing to see that strain or narrative, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, and I've tried to bring it up. It's not coming to the surface at the moment, but it's amazing to see how that has led us into being very narrowly focused on exactly what it is that is unfurling in our nation. Those who simply wish to preserve their history are going to be lumped in, generalized with, included with these so-called white nationalists. And that's the problem. The narrative is being spun in such a way as it's guilt by association. And if you think back to the coverage that we've done going all the way back to the 2016 presidential election cycle, you would recall that one of the things we said is this is something that we can ill afford to allow to come into fruition. That the spin doctors on the left would do anything and everything within their power to make this false narrative stick, and in the arena of American politics, perception, even erroneous perceptions, oftentimes matter more than reality itself. And you see, there's no common sense here. There's no common message, no common approach, and the images that are being spun are designed to shut people's minds off, close down civil discourse, spin the narrative a certain way, and we see that the mayor of Florence, Kentucky has responded to the pandemonium that was unleashed in Charlottesville, Virginia, with a desire to remove the Confederate statues that stand there. But folks, if we think back as to the reason why these monuments were erected in the first place, it was to speak to the fact that there wasn't a family or community in these United States of America that wasn't touched by the horrific, calamitous affair known as the American Civil War. We lost 2% of the population in that battle, or in that conflict, rather, 150 plus years ago. And when we attempt to whitewash our history, when we attempt to erase the vestiges of the past, then we are dooming ourselves to repeat the mistakes of the past, because we're not learning from our history. We're attempting to reopen wounds and scars that were well on their way to being healed. And of course, what happens is, when we have things simplified down into bumper sticker slogans, shallow, hollow, and ultimately meaningless platitudes, the great complexity that brought about that conflagration of malice, hatred, death, and destruction are lost on us. It becomes almost like a child's fairy tale where there's good and evil. But that's not how it played out. That's not the way reality is. History is very complex. and people had differing mores and social values at the time. And then, of course, there is the historical revisionism. You know, one of the things that always comes up in the teaching of the American Civil War is that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation, but that's simply not true. The Emancipation Proclamation is tantamount to an executive order, and the only slaves he could quote-unquote free were those in the rebelling territory. Now, what creates kind of an interesting caveat here is that he, in a sense, recognized the autonomous existence or the separate existence of the Confederate States of America, while the whole time that they had been doing the war or conducting the war, the argument by the Union was that they were preserving the Union and that the Confederacy had no legitimate right to exist in the first place. You see, they were trying to have their cake and eat it too. That's the play that came forth. And then with the United States Supreme Court case, Texas v. White, after the cessation of hostilities, the Supreme Court had ruled that the Confederate States of America had never actually broken away from the United States in the first place because they didn't recognize the ability of the southern states to secede from some sort of perpetual union. So, these arguments that are going forth, and they are inflammatory in their nature, to say that anyone who fought for the Confederacy was a traitor, no. They were fighting for an understanding of the Constitution that they had. That the Constitution is a legal document, a contract. And Contract Law 101 says you cannot be forced to stay in a contract. It was an agreement. And unfortunately, we have moved away from a mindset that it was an agreement, that if you entered into it, you could move out of it. Now, I'm not saying that secession's a good thing. I'm just trying to map out the argument as a great many of the fighting men saw it. Sure, there were those who were there who thought it was all about slavery. But the vast majority of your Confederate soldiers never even owned a slave. In fact, the vast majority of the Confederate population didn't own slaves. And let's not forget the fact that slavery was existent and legal at the time that the conflict erupted. You see, all of these things matter, because they speak to what was going on in the nation at that time, the mindset of the combatants, and the mindset of both sides. And unfortunately, when we ignore this, and when we attempt to make it some sort of cookie-cutter child's fable or fairy tale, it is going to fall flat each and every time. But the fact that we see such divisions lead to animus, hostility, and violence on a scale that we haven't seen in this nation for damn near 40 years, that speaks volumes about just what the current state of affairs in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours really have fallen to. We are not seeing a common good. And I know that that's something that my first officer, Jeremy Graventon, and I have oft-times decried on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. Even our first Air Marshal, Mr. Nelson Ward, has spoken to this as well. And the conservative movement is going to be belied and benign, just attacked, slandered, by the frothing-at-the-mouth Fabian socialist leftists who have a narrative and agenda here that they are completely fixated on. And this narrative and agenda that they are pushing is one of destruction. It is one of division. I know that one of the things that we've said time and again is that they are using the tried, true, and albeit threadbare tactic and strategy of divide and conquer. Well, this is what it comes to. And as I had opened today's Solo Flight Special Edition of our state-of-the-art radio program, it conjures up the image of Washington's farewell address of 1796. When American citizens forget that we are all very fortunate, blessed by providence above with our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights, and we begin to look at the government as some sort of end-all, be-all solution for the cornucopia and plethora of problems that we face, both as a nation and people, that is when the floodgates to tyranny, despotism, but above all, oppression, are allowed to go forth unfettered and unchecked. It is something that we can ill afford to allow to come into fruition in the heart of the land of the free and the home of the brave, and again, it tells me that we don't even recall one of the duties, obligations, but above all responsibilities that was placed squarely on our shoulders in our capacity as United States citizens by the preamble to our shared United States Constitution, namely that we must secure the blessings of liberty not only for ourselves but also for our posterity, meaning for the up-and-coming generations and indeed even those generations which have yet to be born. Unfortunately, this all gets lost in the wayside. Identity politics, coupled with cultural Marxism, is part of a symptom that has arisen from the totality of what the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists have been striving diligently to achieve in the United States, namely that they bamboozle the American people, they distract us, they make us look at each other as though we are foreign and alien, that we are not citizens of the same nation. It's part of the reason why Jeremy and I have always stated that the only nationalist movement that can exist is one about the Constitution, one that looks to the Constitution as the defining characteristic and feature of these United States of America, because it is the Constitution that defines us. The supreme law of the land, which happens to be the longest contiguous or uninterrupted or longest standing constitutional document throughout the entire course of human events, is what defines us. We don't choose to unify around a race, a skin color, a nationality, an ethnicity, or anything like that. We are a nation of laws and not of men. That means that anyone who has achieved the status of American citizen or United States citizen, whether they be natural born or natural live, is endowed by their Creator with the fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. You see, the beauty of that is that the natural law tenets have a very well-established, colorful, and beautiful history. Think back to how I've stated before that it goes back to that muddy field in the summer of 1215 at Runnymede, in which the baronage of England, in other words, the landed nobility, forced King John of Robin Hood infamy to sign the Great Charter, the Magna Carta. And that is where we first see mention of a law of the land, that it was considered the law of the land. That was part of the natural law tenets. Now, was it perfect? No. Everything that man sets down by his own hand is flawed. Man is flawed. We cannot achieve perfection in this earthly mortal realm in which we live. But because the natural law is something that is inscribed on the hearts of all citizens, and can be universally understood through the general and simple application of logic and reason, it makes it the closest thing to perfection we can get. Now, the early stages of the Magna Carta had it only apply to the landed elites, but that began to change with the provisions of Oxford, and then again with the unwritten English Bill of Rights, but it came to its culmination and to its best form when our founding fathers penned the Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. And again, the only way that that was able to come into fruition, to become such a great document as it is because they engaged in civil discourse. There were very heated debates that occurred. Patrick Henry and George Mason had even threatened to walk out and foment rebellion against this because they felt that there was not enough protections for the individual liberties of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people. If you want to know what was truly revolutionary or truly exceptional about the establishment and foundation of these United States of America, it was the fact that we were the first nation throughout the course of human events to recognize that the people are the sovereigns. Now again, all of this may seem repetitive, it may seem abstract just via a cursory glance, but it goes to the heart of who we are as a nation and people. It's something that we should not ignore. It's something we should not sweep aside. But when you look at what happened at Charlottesville over the weekend, where people were injured and killed, where violence became the norm, it's not a reflection of our lofty values. That's not a reflection of who we are, either as a nation or as a people. And it is an unfortunate occurrence. It is something that weakens us. And it's too bad. It's too bad that we have become so blinded by these attempts to essentially make us view one another with animus and hatred, to look upon one another with disdain. And that is what's happening. That is what is occurring right now. Why? Why are we still allowing the vestiges of the past to harm us? It's something that truly doesn't make much sense, unless you think of the ulterior motives that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists are bringing to the table. Their narrative is that of destruction, death and destruction. Now, Rich Lowry did a piece over at the National Review in which he says, we need to mothball Confederate monuments. It's time to put them where they belong, museums and cemeteries. Mr. Lowry, this is part of the problem. It's this selective vitriol, this selective outrage, this attempt to rewrite history that is harming us. Those monuments were all designed to show that we are working to healing towards building a better nation. Now, I will agree with how he starts this piece off. Lowry says Robert E. Lee wasn't a Nazi and surely would have had no sympathy for the white supremacist goons who made his statue a rallying point in Charlottesville, Virginia this last weekend. But he then goes on to say that doesn't change the fact that his statue is now associated with a campaign of racist violence against the picturesque town where Thomas Jefferson founded the University of Virginia. Well, here's the problem, Lowry. The only way that happens is if we allow the propagandists to change meanings. Again, think back to how we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have warned, going back to our premiere episode, which aired on September 11th of 2015, of this dark and twisted game of semantics. Well, semantics can apply to symbolism just as well as to language. It's an attempt to strip and deprive a particular geographical region of these United States of America of their history, but it is part of our shared history. The Civil War impacted the entire nation, not just part of it, all of it. When we start condemning certain attributes of our history in a selective fashion, it opens the floodgates of a slippery slope. And yes, I know that that's considered a logical fallacy, but it does exist. The left never backs off. What's to stop them from saying that, well, because Jefferson was a slaveholder, we got to change the University of Virginia to something else, or remove any reference to him. Monticello needs to be bulldozed or mothballed or put... You see, the thing is, a lot of times these monuments were dedicated by men who were veterans of the Civil War. They were doing their part to rebuild the nation after that conflagration. And just because they were associated with the Confederacy, they should now have all of that removed? It's a part of their history. Should we go and erase all mentions of Sullivan Ross, who was a Texas cavalry leader, led what was known as the Texas Brigade during the height of the Civil War, because he was a Confederate, but he had done a lot to bring education and make it available to poor citizens and to ensure that the nation was on the path to healing. You see, these things, they cannot be viewed in isolation, nor should they be judged by our modern social mores. It makes no sense to do that. Unfortunately, that is what so many are starting to do. There's a lack of knowledge when it comes to the complex nature of American history. And no, I'm not sitting there defending the institution of slavery. It was wicked, it was evil, but it's been gone for 150 plus years. Why reopen these wounds? Why attempt to refight the Civil War? It's because we have not learned from the mistakes of the past. It's because we have not learned to let bygones be bygones, and that has been marching to our detriment each and every time. It's what allows the violence that occurred at Charlottesville to occur. So trying to say that we should remove these monuments or topple these monuments or desecrate these monuments, that is what gave the white supremacists a platform of an attempt to push for legitimacy. But Lowry goes on. He says that the statue of Lee was already slated for removal by the city, but the Battle of Charlottesville should be an inflection point in the broader debate over Confederate statuary. Why? That is playing into the propagandist's hands. That is part of the politics of division. This is, attempting to engage in political correctness and moral relativism, the two twin cancerous doctrines that we have declared total war upon here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer. Those two things are going to be utilized by the cultural Marxists to continue to attempt to drastically, fundamentally, permanently, and irreparably transform these United States of America away from being a constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic into some sort of frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist dystopia torn straight from the pages of an Orwellian nightmare. There simply is no way to escape that. That is what this is boiling down to. That is what this is. It constitutes a very negative attribute, and it is something that cannot be embraced in the heart of the land of the free or the home of the brave. He says, the monument should go. Some of them simply should be trashed. Wrong, Lowry. Others, transmitted to museums, battlefields, and cemeteries. The heroism and losses of Confederate soldiers should be commemorated, but not in everyday public spaces where the monuments are flashpoints and poisonous racial contention. Why? That was their community. It is their descendants that are living in that community. Are you now trying to say that there are certain attributes that were shared as common virtues on both sides should be discarded? Lowry didn't think this through. Lowry did not think this through at all. And all he has done has allowed more animus, more division, more hatred to come forth. And then he says, with white nationalists often mustering in their defense. Of course the white nationalists are going to muster in their defense when there is this racial element applied to it. Antifa is applying racial animus. Black Lives Matter is applying racial animus. It goes both ways. The simple fact of the matter is we want to be left alone. But you cannot let good well enough to be alone. Now he says, some discrimination is in order. There's no reason to honor Jefferson Davis, the blessedly incompetent president of the Confederacy. Really? He was a war hero for the United States. He designed the Capitol Dome. He was the one that did all of the surveying and planning for the Transcontinental Railroad. And he wasn't all that incompetent when you look at just how staggering the odds were against the Confederacy at the time. Again, this is speaking from a lack of knowledge of history and the elements that were on the ground at the time. This is revisionism, and it is dangerous. Yes, you can decry the fact that the Confederacy had slavery, but why don't we talk about Article 2, Section 1? Of the Confederate Constitution that outlawed slave trade. Oh. Now, sure, that's going to, maybe, to some of my critics, have me painted off as being completely sympathetic to the Confederate cause. Well, not entirely. Nobody had clean hands. Yes, slavery was still there. Yes, that was still bad. But guess what? Slavery didn't end in some of the border states that stayed in the Union until the ratification of the 13th Amendment that happened after Lincoln's death. See, again, remember, everybody wants to say that Lincoln freed the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. No, it was the 13th Amendment that was ratified after his death. But here he goes on to say, New Orleans just sent a statue of him to storage. Good riddance. No, Lowry, not good riddance. This inflammatory language, this attempt to besmirch a flawed man who was doing what he thought was right is dangerous. But he says, amazingly enough, Baltimore has a statue of Chief Justice Roger Taney, the author of the monstrous Dred Scott decision, which helped precipitate the war. Again, Taney was following the law as it existed at the time. Again, this sort of attempt to rewrite history and to change the application of what happened there and to apply our modern moral values on it is revisionism. It's dangerous. It is something that is patently absurd and has no place in an open, honest, but above all free society like that of these United States of America. I wish Lowry would have taken more time to consider all of these elements, but it appears as though he has an agenda. He says, a city commission has rightly recommended its destruction. Now, wait a minute. Lowry, why do we condemn ISIS, those Islamofascists, for going around and desecrating ancient sites and monuments? Oh, yes, it's because it is an intolerant point of view. Destruction should never be the lot or the primary impetus of any movement. We should be creative. We should look towards the better angels of our nature. If we're going to go and quote the tyrant Lincoln, because he attempted to obfuscate the truth and to undermine the Constitution. But on that part he was right. A house divided is another one. That's right. When you do this, you are perpetuating the division. You are attempting to erase an integral part of the history of this nation. Shelby Foote had said back on Ken Burns' Civil War documentary in 1988 that to truly have an understanding of modern America, you have to have an understanding of the intricate nature of the Civil War, the causes behind it, the beliefs that were held. And if we're going to go that route, then let's get rid of Grant. Statues of Grant because of Reconstruction. You see, it can go both ways. It must be stopped. Now, he said, Robert E. Lee, on the other hand, is a more complicated case. He was no great friend of slavery. He wrote a letter to his wife that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil in any country. He added shamefully that it was good for blacks. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race. But guess what, Lowry? Flogging was common practice in white society too, particularly in white martial society, meaning military society. So again, 19th century thoughts apply here. You are applying a modern social more to it. Now, that doesn't work. It can't work. It is something that works to the great detriment of what it is that we are attempting to secure as a nation and people. He said after the war, he accepted the defeat and did his part to promote national healing. Yet, faced with a monumentous choice at the start of the war, he decided he was a Virginia patriot rather than an American nationalist. Okay. Lowry, I want you to go back and read what James Madison, the father of our Constitution, had said during the debates on the Constitution. He said that the United States is neither a nation nor a confederacy, that it is a composition. You see, constitutional compositionism, we are neither democracy, nor a full republic, nor a full nation. We are a combination of things. And when you attempt to whitewash the struggles that had existed throughout the course of our relatively brief yet illustrious history here on the face of God's green earth, you begin to deny that that is a part of who we are. You begin to undermine the very concrete core and foundation that defines us as a nation and people. Lowry goes on to say that he told one of President Abraham Lincoln's advisors, I look upon secession as anarchy. If I owned the 4 million slaves in the South, I would sacrifice them all to the Union, but how can I draw my sword upon Virginia, my native state? You know, this all brought up something in the aftermath of that disastrous conflict known as Posse Comitatus. Martial law can only be implemented by Congress per Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2 of the Constitution. And in Ex parte Milligan, the Supreme Court made it very clear that it can only occur when all forms of civil government are destroyed or are incapacitated to the point of not being able to function. You see, we're walking a very dangerous road here, a very dangerous path. One that if we are if we are not careful, it can undo the foundational image that our founding fathers had conjured up for this nation at its inception some 237 plus years ago. And yes, what occurred at Charlottesville is a travesty. That white nationalist that ran his car into people, killing innocent people, that is horrific. But it goes to show that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists are really working at a fever pitch here in an attempt to redefine us, in an attempt to double down on their dark and twisted machinations which will lead to ruination for these United States of America. We have to be cognizant and aware of the dangers that face us both as a nation and people, and to realize that this incremental push towards socialism by either the alt-right or Antifa and these other communistical groups and organizations will lead to the same result. The undermining of the supreme law of the land. Again, this is why we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have always stressed that this is imperative that we promote and foster a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of not only our shared United States Constitution, but also our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. Because in so doing, we can start to parse through all of this. We can cut through the obfuscation and the propaganda and see the light of truth for what it is. But that does require diligence on our part. That does require that we not walk away from this, that we don't turn our backs on our history, that we don't attempt to rewrite all that came to fruition, because if we do that, then the sacrifices that were made will have been in vain. And again, that is not something that we can champion. That's not something we can promote. That's not something that we can embrace. It is dangerous to do that. It's destructive to do that. But he goes on to say, he betrayed the U.S. government and fought on the side devoted to preserving chattel slavery. Wait a minute, Lowry. Lincoln himself had said that if I could save the Union without, freeing a single slave, I'd do it. If I could do it by freeing all the slaves, then I'd do it. That is part of the simplification, the gross simplification of it. And let's talk about how troops were used to invade states that thought that they were within their constitutional right to withdraw, irrespective of what the reason was. The South was not looking to destroy the North. The South just wanted to be independent. If you go back to the American War of Independence, that's exactly what our founding fathers wanted to do from Great Britain. Oh, but everybody will sit there and say it was foreign power. But that's not how they viewed themselves. They viewed themselves as British citizens or subjects. And that did begin to change when the Intolerable Acts were passed, when they were pushed to the brink by the Crown and Parliament of Great Britain in London. You see, that is part of the reason why Jefferson Davis was not completely indicted and charged with reason. Because they rightly realized that you could then condemn the entire impetus that gave birth to these United States of America in the first place. So if we ignore these elements, and if we attempt to embrace the twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism, we are setting ourselves up for failure, and that is not the lot of the American people. That is not what we have done in our relatively brief yet illustrious history here on the face of God's green earth, and it's not something that we should begin doing in the present. But Lowry doesn't seem to quite get that. He said the Civil War was an American conflict with Americans on both sides. Yes, an honorable soldier, Lee, is an apt symbol for the Confederate rank and file whose sacrifices in the war's charnel house shouldn't be flushed down the memory hole. But in a way, that's what you are advocating for, Lowry. When you start selectively picking and choosing to embrace the narrative that is being foisted upon us by the left, it's a trap. It's a trap, and you have fallen for it. Again, the vast majority of the reasons behind this can be focused on the fact that we, as a nation of people, no longer look to ourselves, to self-accountability and self-responsibility, thereby giving us self-determination. We are starting to view the government as an end-all, be-all solution for all of the problems that we face, for all of the problems that we encounter. And that simply can't work.